ministry leaders effectively assess and address the relational needs, maybe of their teams, especially within these cross-cultural contexts?
Say verbally, no. I think most people are on board. I mean, if you say, love your neighbor as yourself, if you're not loving yourself, how could you?
Can you maybe share how you define that? What is your definition of member care within missions, and why do you think it's so essential for successful missionary work?
Right. The way of being taught or led might be so much more of a give and a take kind of relationship than a top down.
Welcome back to the Ministry Growth Show. Today on the show, I'm going to be talking with Candace Pickett. She is the Vice President of Member Care at Avant Ministries. Candace, thanks for being on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about Avant Ministries as we get started in this conversation? What's the origin story? Why do you guys exist?
Sure. Avant Ministries used to be known as Gospel Missionary Union, and we started way back in the 1890s, 1892 to be exact. Yeah. Was started from a group of men in Kansas, of all places, that were part of what was to become known as the YMCA. So there was a few men from that organization that decided that they really wanted to reach people, not just in the U.S., but throughout the world with the gospel. So out of that, a few of those like-minded men kind of started a mission agency. And we've had many different names throughout the years, but Gospel Missionary Union is probably the one we've had the longest, even though now we're called Avant. And in 1892, we first sent missionaries. We were the first Western or North American missionaries to Ecuador and to the Republic of Mali in Africa.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and the mission was to reach the unreached with the gospel, basically. Then, many different people came, many different countries since. About 2003, we rebranded to Avant as the word Gospel Missionary Union. Missionaries in the title, that kind of keeps you from going to secure access countries. And so rebranded as Avant, and that rebranding got really focused on still reaching the unreached with the gospel, but really doing that through church planting. So our mission is to plant churches in areas of the world where the gospel is not known or been heard. And so today we have about 420 missionaries or so serving all over the world. We're a primarily North American sending mission agency, but we have an office in Latin America. We're now starting to send Spanish speakers all over the world. And then we have many different members from many different places all over the world now. So
interesting.
That's who we are.
And are you guys primarily focused on the unreached, unengaged populations of the world still, or is that shifted and changed a little bit?
Primary focus. We do other things, but the focus is church planting to the unreached. So big pushes right now to the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And we consider unreached kind of in our own office terms, less than 2% Christian, and evangelical Christian. So there are some places in Europe where we also focus on.
Okay. And with the shift towards, and the rebrand and shift towards church planting, is it a heavy emphasis and focus on like church planting movement models, or is there another strategy that you guys are pursuing or focused on?
Different strategy. We're familiar with those movements, and I would say that that is not the route we've chosen to go. So back in 2003, we used to do something called short cycle church planting. Full disclosure, I was not here during that time. I just want to make that known to everybody out there who might have different opinions about our short cycle church planting. There was a lot that was good about that, and there was a lot that was learned because of that. But that was a model. There was a book written by Avant called There Is No Time. Basically, the idea is we need to get as many churches out there as we can as quickly as possible. So there was a very specific model at that time that was kind of time-bound, a lot of team focus, going into a place planning churches, there wasn't as much emphasis on language learning. In the country, it was kind of use your trade in a church planning team, and let's produce reproducing churches quickly and get out of there. Like, we don't need to be there for a year. So it was a pushback against what we were seeing at the time of missionaries that pretty much just moved over for life, and the church sometimes that they would develop would still revolve around them. There wasn't any growth of handing that off to kind of national believers.
Okay.
But I would say the pendulum swung a little too far the other direction. And so while on paper that looked like a great idea, there's just a lot of realities that made that kind of a pressure cooker for missionaries and people. And it kind of, not unintentionally, other missions, I think, felt like, well, that's a little arrogant of you guys. You think you're going to do better than what we've been doing this whole time? So I say all this because actually probably the reason I came to Avant is partially because of a lot of the attrition that happened as maybe a result of some of that movements. But it was a really great brand. We had people coming to us from all over wanting to do this. And so I do appreciate Avant, because that was 2003. You know, we're 21 years later. And I would say we have all learned that what we tried to do there was not like a really healthy model. There were some really good aspects about it, but we've moved away from the specifics. But we definitely have these core principles of how we're going to go into a country and plant a church that would be different from like the disciple making movements or the church movements. It's kind of hearkening back to maybe some of the first missionaries of really building community, but also having the foresight of like, how are we handing this off and going forward? But one of our core values is innovation and creativity. So we also really strive to find new ways to do things as opposed to sticking to one modality.
Interesting. So with that shift, can you go into a little bit more specifics on, you shared what you learned, how has the strategy changed, and what does the church planting model look like now? You talked about maybe a more emphasis on community. Is it heavy emphasis on developing national leaders?
Yeah, that's
okay.
That's one aspect. We have something we call our church planning principles, and you know, if you want to get deep into the weeds on that, I'm not the person to talk to. So I'm the member care person. I'm not the strategy person, but you know, I am on the exec team, so we do talk about these things. But we have something I think it's a little unique. We have kind of the thing that guides us are those principles, but one of our vice presidents, Ken Oak, who serves in Europe, he kind of manages some of the field. He develops for his master's project, I think that's correct, some church metrics, healthy church metrics. And so this, like, as a team, people planning a church can like judge, when is my gathering kind of now a church according to like the Bible, like when, you know, like what does it look like in Acts and different things. And then like, when is the church actually healthy? And then when we figure out that it's healthy, that's when you start taking the steps to kind of remove yourself. So I would say a lot of how we plant churches is almost kind of, the metrics are a good way to explain how we do it, because it's showing what we're looking for. And so missionaries can track where they are in that process. And that's been really helpful and really useful. But I would say it depends on the context. Not every church model is going to work in every context with every team and the gifting mixes that are there. So there's kind of these principles that people are guided by, but then what makes sense for you and your team, and really how God is moving. Like, what if God says, no, that's not the way? There's flexibility there to try something different.
Yeah.
So
well, and
I think the flexibility is important.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the reason I ask some more questions than we maybe talked about offline regarding the strategy is, as we get into the discussion around member care, one of the things that I think would be interesting to discuss is, based off of what you learned in those years of learning what strategy works for you guys within the context in which you are working, what are some of the things that you learned out of that can then be applied within the member care work that you are specifically working on? So was there things that you guys saw on the missionary side and your member care work that like, man, we need to make some adjustments even to our strategy that's affecting how our missionaries that we're sending are being affected in the field.
100%. That's actually kind of why. So what's interesting about me and my story and how I even got to Avant and even how we run member care, I think we do member care very differently than most organizations I've run into. Part of that's because of kind of the history of Avant and what was needed at the time and what's still needed. So when I've only been part of the org for about 7 years. So you can do the math. Short Cycle had existed for a bit then. And I don't want to blame all our problems on Short Cycle. That's not it either. But there was just some unique things in the strategy where I kind of came in. I'm like, oh, well, people don't really actually work that way. I mean, if people were robots, this would be perfect. You know, if there was no human emotion or sin or whatever involved, we would be doing great with this.
It always gets in the way. Man.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So I came in and when I was interviewing here, you know, the president kind of sought me out and he said, like, I want you as part of my executive team. And I said, I'll only join if I'm part of it because I think you need somebody from a member care perspective speaking into how you do strategy, how you do policies. So where's the person with the perspective of what makes sense because we have people that are working, you know, how are we building up our people while still having a really good strategy? And so I sit as one of those people, voices at the table when we're deciding things. And I kind of go, well, wait a minute, that's cool. But what about this and this? And so we can kind of navigate that a little bit.
Interesting. So as we get in this topic of member care, can you maybe share how you define that? What is your definition of member care within missions? And why do you think it's so essential for successful missionary work?
Right. So it's funny, when I teach our kind of new candidates coming in, you know, I ask them, what is member care? And you get all kinds of answers. I don't let them like go forward in my PowerPoint deck because then they'll find the answer. But, you know, most people will say, you know, they're there to help us with our emotional, spiritual health, that kind of thing. And I actually kind of say, I think it's anything that's, any part of an organization or group that's looking at caring for you, the missionary, regardless of your work or what you're doing, but kind of the holistic aspect of you. That can be anything from figuring out how you're going to get your tire changed on the field to, you know, like some deep emotional counseling kind of things. But it doesn't need to look like one thing. The member care aspect of agencies is concerned about you and your family and like how you are doing in your relationship with God, with yourself, and with others. And we're less concerned about the mission you're doing. We want you to be healthy and thriving in God's will for your life. And so member care can include, you could just start listing different categories of health, but I would say it would be focused on the people themselves and their health and promoting that health and longevity.
So before you came into the organization 7 years ago, was there any emphasis or focus on that at all? Or is this completely new within that last almost decade?
No, I mean, the only reason I'm here is because it was people were building towards something. It was just a lot more resources were given when I came in. So, I mean, we're a historic mission. I mean, so if you there's a bunch of people in this space that are historic missions. I would say historic missions have had a slower kind of realization that they need this. So, you know, there was back in the, you know, days when 1892, you're going over there, you're packing everything in your coffin. I mean, you're going there to die, and you're somewhat aware of the risks, not 100%, you know, you can't know, but you know there are going to be there. And so it took a certain kind of person back then to go. And I'm not saying that people are that different now, but the mentality around kind of what to expect, what's there, is like people need resources. We now know what's there. We know what people are struggling with. And so I think there was still this mentality from historic orgs like, well, they did it before you, you know? And I'm like, oh, but they had problems too.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah. And so we had in our organization, I would say for the last 40 years, this pastor to missionaries role, where there was somebody kind of looking out for the spiritual shepherding of
Mm-hmm.
the people on the field. But with an organization of more than 400 people, one person can't do that well. And
Right.
so by the time I got in the role, they had realized we need more than this before I got in the role, but they didn't have anybody. So they kind of had a list of the candidate they wanted to run this. And I was called, before I got here, the unicorn for a long time, because it was a list of like things that like everybody's like, you're not going to find that person
Yeah.
to our president. So at the time, without that person, he basically kind of put a open call out to any missionaries in the mission. Hey, are any of you good at care, and would you like to do this?
Mm.
So he selected, there was about, I don't know, 16 maybe people or so that he said, okay, go out and care for people. But there was no like instruction on how to do that well, what to do that, but to care for people kind of regionally. So when
Mm.
I came in, I was on the heels of that. So I was kind of given a team, which honestly, if you're coming in trying to build something, but you're given a team, that was a little rude awakening to me. I was like, wait a minute, I don't get a pick. But it was a blessing because God had picked and they were the right people. And
Mm.
so I built upon that, and then we built a much bigger, broader structure and brought a lot of organization into it. But yeah, Avant had thought of it, but there wasn't much, I would say, organizing principles behind it until we kind of all got together and moved that direction.
Interesting. So let's back up a little bit. You mentioned the importance of health in a couple different areas: relationship between us and God, relationship between us and others, and maybe specifically in what I want to hone in on is relationship between us and ourselves. How much pushback do you guys get with that statement, that that relationship piece within the church?
Within like the Big C church or
Yeah,
within
Big C
specific church?
church. Is that something that you get pushback on as like that's something that we should not even be discussing? Is that hard for people to grasp or wrap their heads around as something that we should be caring about and interested in? And like, how is that something that you see?
I would say verbally, no. I think most people are on board. I mean, if you say, love your neighbor as yourself,
Mm-hmm.
if you're not loving yourself, how could you possibly love your neighbor? I feel like we always miss that whole
Mm-hmm.
statement there. And so when I teach on it, we talk about kind of self-care and the care of those around you as two sides of the same coin. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can't have one without the other. So if you're not caring well for yourself, you can't care well for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important that you do that. So I'd say verbally, everybody's like, yeah, absolutely. But then like practically speaking, when you dig into their life, you're like, oh, but you're actually not doing well caring for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So like a good example of this is we give our missionaries, everybody gets 5 weeks of vacation. I have a training once a year where I ask the ones that come to the training, all right, I want you to put on a piece of paper how many days off you took from ministry this year,
Mm-hmm.
including your vacation, but then like your regular Sabbath, which we also tell people to do, and any holidays you took. And I want you to just measure the time and let's divide it by the number of days. And I go, it's not going to be 100% accurate, but most often I get, including their Sabbaths, mind you, 2 weeks the whole year that they had off.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm like, well, what's going on here, guys? And it's kind of like an awakening to them because they actually think they're doing it. They're like, oh, yeah, but stuff happens. I go, but stuff's always going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't actually be healthy and like be really effective at your best if you're not kind of doing that piece. And others,
Mm-hmm.
and I usually talk about this with leaders, I'm like, others around you will do what you're doing, not what you're saying.
Mm.
You kind of got to live and say the same thing.
Interesting. Yeah. So as you guys have developed, that was just a side note. I wanted to go a bit off topic there because I have seen a little bit of pushback on that piece. We're supposed to deny ourselves. Why would we ever want to look into figuring out what's going on and how maybe my past affects how I relate to God? Like, I think it's an incredibly important piece that from what I've seen and the ministry leaders I've talked to inside and outside of this show, oftentimes there is a little bit of a pushback on that, like,
Well,
so
so
it's interesting.
I'm a clinical psychologist, so I will say that's where the pushback comes from, right? Like,
Yeah.
I was trained as a
Right.
clinical psychologist. So self-care, I feel like those terms we're good with, but the minute you start bringing psychology into this, and I would say specifically with our older demographic, our younger ones are almost like, I'm like, okay,
Duh.
you're not
Yeah.
defined by your disorder. Like, get off the defining yourself by whatever disorder you think you have. Like, let's,
Yeah.
so it's almost like swung the other way with our younger folks. But
Yeah.
the older ones, it's like, could you see how this much stress is leading to X, Y, and Z?
Mm-hmm.
And what I've had to learn to do is I downplay the fact that I'm a psychologist. Half the people don't even know, or they
Mm-hmm.
don't want to know. And you just use spiritual terminology for the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're very happy with that.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
you know,
Interesting. So what as you have developed maybe these systems and processes, and I'm sure you have curriculum around the stuff, the systems that you've created, what have you learned about member care as you've developed these member care systems?
I would say one size does not fit all. So,
Interesting.
I specifically, when I joined Avant, before this, I was with a different mission org somewhere else doing stuff. And part of my call to member care was experiencing a lot of hard
Mm-hmm.
stuff on the field. Coming back, knowing I wanted to do this, and when I got my PhD, thinking I need as much knowledge as I can to kind of figure this out. And then God, I don't even know how to sign up for this, but God found me and definitely called me here to this position.
Mm-hmm.
I spent the first year to 2 years just getting to learn the mission,
Mm.
not like the people, but like, what is this mission? What's the culture of the organization? And what do people need? What are they missing? And I'm now consulted with a few other organizations after kind of building up our structure here. And they're always like, well, how did you do that? And I'm like, well, what we're doing isn't actually going to fit 100% what you're doing. It
Mm-hmm.
fits because I would say our model at Avant, and I've learned Avant is probably the most relational mission I've ever worked for, in the sense that relationship is the key value there. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't know that coming in, I mean, it's a good and a bad thing. Everything happens through relationships. So if you're kind of not in relationship, or you feel like it should be more corporate, you're going to have a really rude awakening. So,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of beauty in that there's a lot of grace and there's a lot of walking with people. And so, but things happen through relationships. So you need to get to know somebody and build trust before you can kind of work on the project you want to work on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I had to really learn that before I knew how to implement what care was going to look like. So I would say we give a lot of care, but it's all done through relationship. The people that I have on the field doing care know that it's going to take 2 to 3 years for them to build into people's lives before it's really going to take effect. And so we're
Mm.
very intentional in how we're building relationship with people that I don't often see in other models.
Mm.
But that might not work for an organization that's more corporately kind of organized.
Interesting. Yeah. Context is key inside or on the field just as much as it is inside of the organization. How have you guys found that prioritizing member care impacts the effectiveness and the longevity of missionary teams in the field? We see that, I mean, ministers are burning out like crazy, missionaries are burning out. Like there's this do go mentality within the church. How have, as you guys have taken a step back at that and shifted in your strategy and therefore shifted in this more relational approach um, and instituted some systems around member care, what are you learning and what are you seeing that is impacting that effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, so actually when when the guy that hired me, our president hired me, he said, "I'm bringing you in to stop the bleeding, so to speak." I believe those are his exact
Mm,
words. And I said, "Ooh, well then that's not my job." I said, "I'm not
mm,
here to help you with your attrition. Um, I'm here to make sure your people are thriving in God's will for their life, whether
mm,
that's with us or outside of us. Like God sometimes calls us somewhere else. And
mm-hmm,
I'm going to promote that in somebody. I'm not going to say, oh, no, but you got to stay with Avant, which I said in turn should help people stay with our organization if they're really feeling like the organization is caring for them. But that's not my goal. and I'm not going to be judged based on those numbers. I'm kind of forthright.
Yeah.
So he said, okay. But I said, but let's track this. So he tends to track this, or he has. And he's like, well, they are going down. And I go, okay, yeah, that's just a natural, I think, thing when people really realize they're feeling valued and cared for. But a big piece of my heart and our heart at Avant is prevention, like preventing problems from arising. So I would say our model is helping with that kind of effectiveness, because what we're doing is we're trying to get to know people. We're not their boss coming in saying, how are you doing? And, oh, but I need you to do X, Y, and Z.
Mm.
We have relationships with every person on the field, and we're just getting to know them. How are you doing? How's your family? And we're constantly, even if somebody doesn't need something at that time, we're still connecting with them. And part of what I do is I kind of sit up here and I call us taking the temperature of the field, or like, okay, that person's kid's having an issue in school. Let's just track that for a bit. Okay, it's getting worse and it's getting worse. Well, now let's step in and offer some resources and help and try to, get people going different places before that becomes an issue where they leave the field. Or that's taking them away from their ministry because now they're focusing. I mean, it's just an example on this kid, and let's maybe take them out for 3 months and really focus on them so we can put them back. Whereas the older model, or some models still I see, are like, you kind of wait till crisis and then you intervene. And that I don't really think helps with your longevity. It might help them kind of finish well, but kind of intervening before we get to kind of a crisis point, I feel like helps people continue in their job, though we might be taking them away for shorter periods of time for longer time in their ministry and effectiveness. So I have seen it contribute. And a lot of, like, I would say that I think the first, and I think some research just bears this out, reason people leave the field prematurely are for family issues, whether that's older, aging parents at home, or kids with issues, or a marriage with problems. I mean, the next one down is teen, but the first one's family. So kind of tracking with that.
Yeah. Interesting. Are there challenges that you've experienced in this as you've developed this, and things that you run into that are, it sounds like the answer is yes.
Yeah. Understatement of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I came in, I mean, this is an organization that I love, I think is great. I came in, I mean, you can hear from my voice that I'm a woman. I was the first woman on our executive team ever in the history of Avant, and I was the youngest. And I was coming in at an executive level, so the message is care is important to our organization, and it hadn't been operating like that this whole time. So like I came in kind of as a symbol of change in a lot of ways, and change is usually not that
painful.
Welcome sometimes. So I would say, and again, because we're so relational, and again, I had to learn that, just because you've studied something and done something, you're not really accepted as part of the group until that relationship's been built. So I'd say, like, my struggle, my pushback a lot of times was, don't mess with that. Why are you messing with that? Why are you touching that? Like, this is things we've done for years. Like, oh, my favorite is, oh, well, we've always done it that way. That's not a good excuse. Maybe we shouldn't. And so I would say I got pushback more from just like, this does affect how our strategy is going to change, how it's going to affect the whole organization. So there was pushback on different things I wanted to implement, or different things I thought might be helpful. But over time, I've been here for 7 years now. I would say it was actually around the 4 or 5 year mark. I felt like, oh, okay, this is what we're all about now. Like, everybody's on board. Like, care is important. Care is good. And when we get new people into our organization now, they'll often say, an answer I hear often is, why Avant Ministries? And they'll say, because of the great care. That's why they choose us. And it's not just the member care department. I think it's because our whole organization, top to bottom, from the person that cleans the floors in our offices here up to the president, puts all their resources behind that and really values the missionary. So, but that's not just me, that's been the whole mission, but we've been through a change process, and there was a lot of resistance to, what does this mean for me and my specific ministry here?
Yeah, that shift of saying that we cared about this but not actually behaving in the way that was consistent with our words, to now our words are consistent with how we're behaving and how we're acting. That always comes with some pain and challenge and struggle, huh?
Well, and resources. Like you're now
Yeah.
devoting resources that were devoted over here to this over here. And it takes time to see like why that was important. And I think we're all behind that now.
Mm.
But like I don't know of many missions that do this, but like if we have somebody that's struggling on the field and we kind of have been tracking it and we're like, okay, this is a point where we need to intervene. You know, there are a lot of wonderful organizations out there that aren't missions themselves. They're kind of para-mission, if you,
Mm-hmm.
that do member care, that have counselors that will do a program to like restore. Like we'll say, if you can't pay for that, like we're going to fund that because we want you to go do that and come back healthier. And so, I mean, we have this funding bucket that we call like the emergency health bucket, but basically it's for people that need that kind of stuff. We'll put our money where our mouth is. Like
Mm.
like we care about it, so we're gonna invest in that and invest in you.
Yeah. Do you find that a large percentage of the missionaries that you have sent and are pouring into um, take advantage of these resources and actually use them, or do you have to encourage them into it oftentimes?
Mostly it's encouraging them into it, but that's part of the education piece. I don't. It's funny. The younger ones, sometimes I'm like, okay, you've been dipping in the bucket a lot lately. You know, like that's fine, but I think you can do it, you know, with a good friend now, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, you have the resources, you have the skills. It's more the long termers that have been out there for a while that usually we're having the conversation. We think this would be beneficial, and then usually the first thing is, well, we couldn't possibly afford it. And I go, well, that shouldn't be an excuse. We're going to figure that part out, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's us partnering with your sending church to help pay or to pay the whole thing or for you to pay some of it. You know, it's different in each, but that shouldn't be the reason. And so then you come up to the different barriers of like, well, I don't know, I don't want to take my time away from this. And sometimes, and that's why I say like it has to be a whole organization thing. I have the field vice president and myself, we both agree this needs to be done. It's kind of not an option anymore.
Mm.
Like we
Yeah.
don't give you the option. And it's funny because they usually go and they're a little mad in the beginning, and if they come out and they're like, I learned so much, this was so good,
Yeah.
everybody should have to do this. I'm like, okay,
Should be a requirement. Yeah.
yes. I'm like, oh, you didn't want it to be a requirement earlier, but okay.
Yeah. That's funny. Well, Candace, this has been good so far. I want to make sure that we take a moment to hear from today's sponsor. But when we come back, I want to continue our discussion with Candace Pickett of Avant Ministries. Hey, ministry leaders. Today's episode is sponsored by Click Nonprofit. Are you looking to grow your ministry but don't have the money or marketing knowledge to make that happen? There's good news. Google offers an advertising grant to churches and ministries that is worth $10,000 per month. This means that if your ministry is a 501c3 nonprofit, you are eligible to receive $120,000 per year in free advertising dollars. This allows you to place ads at the top of Google search results page and drive thousands of visitors to your ministry website every month. Our sponsor, Click Nonprofit, helps your ministry acquire this Google ad grant and then manages your Google ads to ensure you get the most out of the grant. Schedule a free consultation at clicknonprofit.com to learn more about how this grant can help your specific ministry. Mention the Ministry Growth Show when you sign up and get 20% off your first 3 months of management. All right, welcome back to the Ministry Growth Show. We've been talking with Candace Pickett of Avant Ministries. Candace, as we get back into the conversation, I want to maybe go a little bit more granular and talk logistics on what this looks like, application, how you guys are applying what we've been talking about, maybe more at a high level, so that ministry leaders might be able to glean some insights and expertise from what you guys are doing. So how can ministry leaders effectively assess and address the relational needs, maybe of their teams, especially within these cross-cultural contexts, and then therefore develop systems and processes that allow them to provide better care for the people on the field?
Yeah, I think it needs to start with a posture, the posture of being a learner. Like what does it mean for me as as a leader to like realize that I don't know you, I don't know
Mm-hmm.
your context, I don't know your history, I don't know all the details about you. So I'm going to come in kind of as a learner in that range. I'm learning you, basically, who you
Mm-hmm.
are, how you work, and then how we work together. So, like, what are we building? Um, because if you don't have that kind of relationship, how are you going to lead well into maybe
Mm-hmm.
what is your expertise, like ministry, principles or strategies? Um, I think that's like the biggest misstep I see is people come in with an expectation that people are just going to follow
Mm-hmm.
without that kind of understanding and pull of who they are and how they work well. So that being like really the key is be curious, get to know people, how they work, and be flexible. Then
Mm-hmm.
be able to flex for what their um, way of being taught or led might be. So much more of a give and a take kind of relationship than a top down. There still need to be probably some clear lines of hierarchy and authority, um,
Mm-hmm.
but much more like we're the kingdom of God working together. The head is not more valuable than a toe. So like, how are
Mm-hmm.
we? But how are we kind of working together to do that? And then learning what are the needs. Like everybody's going to have a very different set of needs, and some people aren't the kind of people that are going to reach out. So what I see happen a lot as far as member care goes is the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Mm-hmm.
So the one that is either causing the most problems or is asking for help the most, those are the ones that get tended to. Whereas the ones that are more quieter, kind of in the background, just serving, even though they might be suffering, aren't getting tended to because it's
Mm.
the tyranny of the urgent. But that's where I'm
Yeah.
like, you really have to know who's working for you, what their personalities are, and and building in space to be checking in. Like
Mm.
that's part of your role. Like, no, I don't just need to be about numbers or about this. Like part of my job is shepherding. And what is that?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to that relational aspect that you've been talking about so much as maybe core, obviously core to the DNA of the organization. If and that the same principles apply within like relationship development for a disciple making context. How can I actually, uh, rather than make a convert and make an actual disciple who's a disciple maker without having a relationship with that individual and caring for that person and stepping into what they're going through and experiencing. So yeah, that's interesting. Um, do you have any stories that have come out of what you guys have done as you've developed your member care systems and processes that have that maybe you would highlight and point to as things that as stories that are significant, pointing to the value of what you are doing specifically?
Yeah. I think before there wasn't space in our organization to have somewhere you could go when you were struggling with things that, a missionary shouldn't struggle with or whatever that is, without
Mm-hmm.
feeling like you're going to get kicked out or I don't know, or like there's going to be some kind of punitive thing. So like a huge one, for example, is pornography. So
Mm-hmm.
pornography use is quite prevalent in the secular world and in the church.
Right.
And if you don't know that, your head's a little in the sand, like,
Yeah.
you know.
Yep.
But the problem is like, okay, then what do you do with it, right?
Right.
So I think, there's a lot of great software out there, but software is only as good as software is. It's not a heart change thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a tool. So I think coming in here, I feel like a lot of what we had was like, oh, here's some software and get an accountability partner and, you should be good. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, not so much. So we actually all just went through Nat Stringer's book, Unwanted. It's a really good book for anybody wanting to kind of learn more about, um, how to address. Basically, it's the focus is sexual health and wholeness within theological, and within our belief system. But how are
Mm-hmm.
we promoting that as opposed to just policing bad
Mm-hmm.
behavior? So, kind of like a story out of that is, first off, I'm very direct and I kind of interview a lot of our candidates before they come into Avant. I'm very specific and I ask about their pornography use.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you're not asking you're often not getting the real answer. But I
Right.
find that especially younger folks, the minute you ask, they'll tell you their whole their whole history, but nothing's worked like solution wise. Like they're desperately trying not to view pornography, but they keep slipping up. But they're like, I just call my accountability partner, and then it keeps happening. And so
Right.
I think for us, and it's actually a thing we're doing right now with our whole team, is trying to figure out how do we address this holistically within our organization. Like there is something specific about being a missionary in a mission context overseas that's struggling with this issue as opposed to somebody in their home culture.
Mm.
And so like how are we as a mission actually not just talking about it, but providing resources that are actually going to help. And so the cool things we've done is figured out who in our organization has dealt with this on the field and dealt with it effectively, and what are the takeaways. So I would say there have been situations where we've had somebody on the field where they've divulged, and they never would have divulged before to their team leader, to their member care person, hey, I'm struggling with this. And our people in Avant know that that is confidential so long as you want to get help. We
Mm.
will probably encourage you to tell your team because we know your team. We know they're not going to be punitive. But we will also come into that space with you to tell your team so you feel like you have an advocate or somebody that has your back. And then we'll
Mm.
put a plan together. What does this look like for you to get healthy and come back? Like this shouldn't take you off the field. The trouble's been though, sometimes sending churches feel differently. So I have definitely gone to
Oh,
people's
interesting.
churches before and explained, hey, we're bringing this person back because they need some more intensive counseling right now to figure out what their triggers are and get some kind of, I mean, I use addictive terms. Not everybody's addicted, but like some sobriety or some time under their belt without the stressors before we can send them back. But the church
Mm-hmm.
doesn't get it. So then I will fly somewhere, I will drive somewhere, I'll show up with the missionary, and I'll give a whole lecture on on like basically from the psychological kind of point of view of like what this really is, how we deal with it, why we can get this person back to health, and how like at least 6 people in the room I'm talking with right now are dealing with the same issue. You just don't know about it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I've watched us do that, and yeah, it takes time away, but get people back to the field where, and I also say, you're never going to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be slip ups, but it's what do you do after that? And I think we've seen people restored to health. We've seen people feel seen, and then their community does buy into the thing. We've seen the other where the community says, oh, we're not comfortable with this, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been cool to see how that's been like a growing, I would say, culture of transparency around that. And not just transparency for transparency's sake, but kind of traveling together somewhere. And I would say we don't have that all figured out. We're still figuring out how to do that well. But I think that's been a very common thing that we've seen growth in, as opposed to us finding out about it, which is what would used to happen, and it being way too far down the road and a big, I hate the term, but moral failure is what people call it, on
Mm-hmm.
the field. And being this huge, scandal kind of thing, like kind of
Yeah.
taking the shame, taking all that out of it and going, okay, what is this? And how do we help you get to like a place of relational health?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How with those that are in the field, especially within your context where you guys are primarily sending to unengaged, unreached, like really difficult, oftentimes really difficult or hostile places to the gospel. What are you seeing on the trauma side where people are, if they're in those places, oftentimes they're seeing things regularly that are really hard and traumatic, whether that's big T or little t trauma. Um, what have you learned through this member care process maybe about that specifically, and how to step in? You talked about vulnerability and transparency, and just the fact that you talk about it and address it and bring it up and pursue it. Like that's different than a lot of organizations. But like, how are you caring for that? Caring for people who are experiencing those things that are still staying in the field, and I'd be interested to explore that a little bit.
One, I think that's a multifaceted thing for us because we are aware that that's where we're sending people and what's going on.
Uh-huh.
So, like, one of the first things I did when I started here, as I said, all of our people that are doing the on the field care need to be trained in psychological first aid. That's just an easy, you can even do it online, but it basically teaches you basically how to not re traumatize somebody in a trauma. So, it's kind of
Mm,
basic. Like, I need everybody that's going to be like the first line people to know when to see like that somebody's reacting to trauma and how to not like further that traumatic kind of reaction and kind of be able to get them to a place of safety. And so,
mm-hmm.
and all the people are educated in like what would be expected and what would be like unexpected reactions to trauma kind of in the field. So but proactively, even before any of our missionaries go, they all go through a security kind of a security training where they talk a lot about the theology of risk,
Mm-hmm.
and like why are we taking this risks, like why do we choose to do this, and then if an event, and they go through all different ones, they actually do like in vivo experiences of these different traumas before they go. And we have some people react during those, which we try to screen out so that doesn't happen. But if we do, then we kind of say, whoa, well, we gotta work on this because we know we're sending you to a place where this could be a real thing. And
This
so
is
we
gonna be a
need,
regular thing.
yes,
Yeah.
like you're not ready, you know?
Reacting that way in training, what's it gonna
You're
look
right.
like in real life? Yeah.
And I mean, we've had maybe three of those out of like the 100 or something we've sent through. So, but I mean, there were three that we didn't expect. So
Right.
it was a good like preventative piece of going, okay, how do we help you kind of deal with all these pieces? I mean, I definitely specifically ask everybody's assessed for a history of trauma before they go, but then it's how once we get there, our regular debriefing. I mean, that's part of the job of our member care folks on the field is to just hear their stories, be in relationship, have a place where they're asking pointed questions so that somebody's talking and integrating. Regular debriefing is really important, especially if you're in one of those kind of higher trauma situations with
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's looking for trauma reactions, right? Like, are you getting kind of your breath getting shallow as you talk about this? Are you getting kind of like, your posture changing?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of noting that and helping somebody going, okay, maybe it's too much right now. Maybe we need to not go back into the context for a little bit, and teaching people how to self care. The other thing that I think is really missing, and I'd say we're trying to do a better job of this, but people don't have a very good, I don't know, theology of suffering. Like, what
Mm.
does it mean to suffer for Jesus? Um, and what does it mean if I'm suffering? Um, and I'd say like we don't want people to just go and be a martyr because I see that person too. Like I must suffer for Jesus. Like no, no, not you. That's just part of the world. You mustn't. If you don't, that's great,
Mustn't if
But
you
if you
don't.
are, yeah. Well, it's like I need to suffer. I'm like, no, I don't think that's in the Bible really.
Yeah.
Um, like I need to go find my own personal suffering.
Gotta go find it.
Um,
Dive in.
yes. But for people that are, it's like a lot of it's like, where is God in this? Like
Mm-hmm.
like I was following God's call. What is this? And I don't know that the Western church lately has done a great job of kind of um, diving into that. So I'm thinking we're having to pick up those kind of things. And there's a lot of great books we can go through, but it's more than that. It's walking alongside and also being the witness, like bearing witness. I think is really important to somebody's suffering,
Yeah.
and kind of being that sojourner that can come along. And like I said, like when you can't pray, we're there to pray with you, to pray for you.
Mm-hmm.
We know you'll get back there, but like that's what the body of Christ is for. And so I think just being really intentional about that, but knowing that we're not going to negate trauma, and we have a strong purpose for going to those places. We think
Mm-hmm.
that's more important than risk, but we also assess risk too. Like, should we send five blonde-haired white kids into kind of the terrorist region of a certain area where the kids are posting on social media left and right all the time? No, that's probably not a good idea. We could probably send somebody that's gonna match the culture a little better there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And how does this all play out specifically with this investment in, at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about an investment in pouring into national leaders, um, to, especially like you just talked about, going to places where it's a little bit more contextually relevant. Um, what are you learning in the member care side with national leaders who are from different contexts and cultures than you guys are? Is the member care process different, or is it maybe, what's the word I'm looking for, universal?
I think the need for care is universal. I would say the
Yeah.
member care practice and process is very different. And I am the first to say I
Interesting.
am not an expert in how to deliver care to other cultures.
Mm,
I didn't grow up in them. It's not my heart language. Even though I could learn a lot about another culture, I'm never going to be native in that culture. And so
right.
I'm really aware. So, for example, right now, we started sending Spanish speakers from Latin America overseas. Now, I speak Spanish, but I'm not a native. I mean, you can't see me. This is a podcast. I have blonde hair and pretty white. Okay, I am not
Mm-hmm.
a native from Latin America anywhere. And when we were thinking about sending people, I said, well, who's going to do their care? Like
Mm,
I don't think I'm going to be great. I can be in the middle right now, but I'm not the best option. And so God's bigger than any of our ideas, and so we now have Latinos doing member care for Latinos right now. And it is
mm,
different. We actually have a different model of how we do that because the culture is more
interesting.
communal and it's actually even more relational than ours. So, like, whereas on the Western side, we don't jump into the member care role till they're on the field. Like, I mean, I help in training and stuff, but the relationship between we call them regional member care facilitators, doesn't really actually happen until they reach the field. On my
Okay.
Latino side, it happens long before then. And those facilitators go and meet the church that's sending them as well because it's much more communal. So, like, they have this
Mm,
longer term relationship, but it wouldn't work if we did it the Western way. They'd be like, who
yeah.
are you and why are you in my life? you
Mm-hmm.
know? Um, and so when we're talking about national leaders in all different cultures, like, I've kind of been really honest, if we're going to push this way, and this is kind of missions is to everywhere from everywhere kind of model these days, we have to realize where we're competent and where we're not,
Mm,
and be honest about that. And I'll be honest, I'm not competent in figuring out what care looks like for them. But we have different status of membership. So, like, people that serve in their own country, I would call that more of like a national leader. So, we're building up somebody in Kenya, and now they're serving, as a pastor in Kenya, but they joined our organization. I kind of tell them, I don't know that we can do this well for you. We want you to build up your own community around you, and we want you to prioritize your time to do that. We will have a bucket if you were to need counseling, but we're going to try to
mm-hmm.
find you counseling in your culture, in your context, but we can help fund that for you. Like,
Interesting.
just because you're Kenyan doesn't mean, but you're not going to, there's not, it's weird. We tried it once, like bringing our Western regional care facilitators to the national person and being like, here, I'm here to get to know you. And they're like, why? It's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know why. That was a silly idea. So,
Yeah. Well, it'd be so easy to just say, "Hey, we've got our member care team, and it applies in all contexts and cultures, and we've checked that off our box, and we're good to go." We are doing that, and not think about it from, I mean, just in the same way we think about missions from a contextually relevant context is key perspective. Why would that be any different in member care?
right.
Interesting.
And there is something different about leaving your host culture, going to a different culture, where I think that's where the member care piece, there's some
Mm,
specialties there where if you're in your home culture, the idea, I'm not saying it always bears out, is that you already have those deep relationships. Like, you're not leaving
mm-hmm,
them to go somewhere. But we do have people now, that's what I'm saying, we have a Latin American member care team that are going
mm-hmm.
from, Argentina all the way over to the Middle East somewhere. Like, they're leaving
Yeah.
cultures. But how they want to be cared for is culturally different
Mm-hmm.
than a Westerner might be like, why are you up in my business right now?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the benefits, seems to be one of the benefits of this. You see maybe, I don't know how many, within the last however many decades, this major push towards national leader, um, making sure that our missionaries are in a place that is contextual to where they grew up. So you're within that context, you're probably not experiencing as much trauma or um, just the culture shock that happens when a Westerner goes into a place that they don't look like the people that they're serving and reaching. But that doesn't mean it's not happening, right? It's might be lessened, but
No, and what's fascinating, like our Latinos, because I do like a
uh-huh.
thorough history on everybody before they join. And I ask about trauma. And like you can't actually ask about the word trauma because that's just normal life half the time for them growing up. They don't
Just
consider that
everybody does.
trauma. That's just
Yeah.
everybody has an uncle that went to prison. Like seriously,
Yeah.
that's
What?
everybody has an uncle that went to prison. What are you talking about? It's like, oh, right. So that probably wasn't traumatic for you in the same way that it might be for somebody in the, U.S. or Canada. And so redefining terms too, but like trauma reactions are universal. Like there is PTSD. So it's preparing people too and learning to ask the right questions because what's trauma
Yeah.
for me might not be
Yeah.
trauma for you.
Interesting. Well, let's take another moment to hear from today's sponsor. But when we come back, I want to continue our discussion with Candace Pickett of Avant Ministries. Hey, church leaders. Today's episode is sponsored by Kingdom Stories. When it comes to your digital marketing and content strategies, have you ever wondered how you can use the power of storytelling and testimony? Imagine the impact. Stories and testimonies that resonate, that move hearts and minds. Testimonies that prepare people to receive gospel truths. Here's the problem. You're busy doing ministry and you don't have time to worry about your content strategies. And you definitely don't have time to worry about one more program. You already have too much on your plate. And the consequences? You're not taking full advantage of digital. The content you do post gets ignored. You have no plan or strategy for your digital engagement. And ultimately, God doesn't get the glory he deserves because we're not testifying of his transformational and redemptive work. What would it look like if your people knew how to share their testimony? Your monthly content strategies were filled with stories instead of self-promotional content, and your content was focused on your people and God's work in their lives. What if your content was actually engaging because it was story-driven? Kingdom Stories is more than a service. It's a catalyst for transformative digital communication. Stories change lives. Stories are engaging, and everyone has a story. What has happened in my life can happen in your life too. Here's the best part. You don't have to do the heavy lifting. Kingdom Stories will handle everything from start to finish. If you want to learn more or get our free content strategy map that will outline the entire process, go to kingdomstories.us. We know how overwhelming and frustrating content strategies and digital marketing can be, so we've solved that problem for you. Stop creating aimless content. Let us help you tell the stories coming out of your ministry. Let stories and testimonies fuel your church's digital outreach. All right, welcome back to the Ministry Growth Show. We've been talking with Candace Pickett of Avant Ministries. Candace, as we get back into the conversation, can you talk about the role of storytelling specifically within your member care and what you guys are doing with you and your team, and how storytelling shows up and plays itself out in that context?
Yeah. I mean, so like as a psychologist, we have a whole strand of kind of theory called narrative kind of therapy or narrative counseling. The whole idea that we are all embedded in story. We are made for story. We are all kind of part of our own narrative. And so without knowing the larger context of the story, how can you really help somebody? And when I think about that in member care, kind of within our own organization too, I mean, that's part of even, maybe it beckons back to the beginning of our conversation. Part of me even coming in and saying, I think member care looks different organization to organization is like, well, what is the story of the organization? Like what has happened here that is different than something that happened here? And how do people see where they fit in the story? Are people sold that I'm part of Avant's story? No, we're all part of God's story, right? And then what's my piece of that story? And so I think there are some people's minds who think more like that. Some people would have a really hard time understanding what I'm talking about. Like they're much more kind of linear or in a box. But I think a lot of what we do is really getting to know the person and hearing their story and not making, I would say, judgment calls just kind of traveling with somebody and being a piece of that story.
Mm-hmm.
So, I sometimes use techniques like this, but I'm like, okay, in this, like, where is our protagonist right now in this story? Like seeing you as in a story, in God's story, but also in your own story of what God's doing in your life. Where are you? And maybe we're the sidekicks that come alongside you right now and helps you through this part of the journey. Or maybe, your church comes in as a character, like as this body. And maybe the thing you're fighting or the thing you're struggling with, let's use pornography, for example. I'm like, that's the villain right now. And like,
Mm-hmm.
where is the villain hiding in this that we're not looking for him? Because if you're not looking for him, he's going to show up. And just talking through like how is, and then, our member care is relational. This is not just a therapy room. So,
Mm-hmm.
so we talk a lot about like how your story is impacting my story and how I'm growing because I'm interacting with what's happening here. It's a lot of mutuality, a lot more uh, than I think I even see in some churches sometimes. But I think that's part of our DNA is living and walking and learning each other and walking together through that space.
Mm. Now, there's a couple of directions we could go on that. Maybe let's zero in on that, the psychology and therapy piece to it. So what you guys are doing, you would not say this is just psychology and therapy offered up to our members. What we're creating is environments where we can develop community and share story with one another and grow in our faith through the process of sharing our story and exploring our stories and having the permission and vulnerability to look back on our stories and how they play into how we interact with God. Like that would be more of the approach that you guys are taking than, hey, we're just offering therapy sessions to all of our members so that we can work through some stuff.
Right. And I would say, no, we're definitely not doing that. I mean, if that's
Interesting.
needed, and I think it is, there are so many great organizations out there that can provide that these days. Well, we just
Mm-hmm.
refer that out. I go, that you do probably need to work with a therapist. It actually might be good. You might not feel as comfortable sharing all that with somebody within your organization.
Mm.
Even if you think you are, you might not. So like, let's find you a good, Christian counselor, Christian therapist. They can meet with you, but we're not bowing out. We're gonna be right alongside you during this time, and we're
Mm.
gonna, share stories. And I mean, I like the word sojourn. We're just gonna sojourn together,
Mm.
and that impacts me as well. Like that impacts us, the caregiver, as well. It's not a one-sided. I would say it's more one-sided in that we are there to care for you, but there's more mutuality there.
Do you find that this is, um, as you invite your members into this process, that it is foreign, maybe?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to go back to age, but I think we've noticed we have some fields that are more of our historical fields that have probably
Mm-hmm.
more of our like older baby boomer generation,
Okay.
um, even Gen X to some degree. And then we have fields that are much newer fields for us, where most of our millennials are starting to be Gen Z kind of people. And I would say the millennial Gen Z, like, this is great. This is what I want, like, we get
Interesting.
globbed onto. The other ones, and so like I can remember my member care people that went down there the first time. They're like, nobody wants us here. Like nobody wants me to be like calling them. I'm like, okay, well, first off, member care shouldn't be something we force on somebody. So
Yeah.
if they don't want it, I say you keep reminding them that you're here. We don't push. We just say, hey, once a month, call them up and say, or send them a message just reminding you, like, we're here, any prayer requests you might have. And we slowly start to build that relationship. And what's amazing is the field I'm thinking of, which is mostly our kind of South American kind of field,
Mm-hmm.
is that it took about 3 years. But now those are some of the people that go to them the most, that want this
Mm.
the most. It's like they didn't want it. They think they didn't need it. And now that they have it, they're like, this is great. I could have used this
Mm.
year one in my career. But now, like, some of the people I would have told you, like, yeah, they're never really gonna pick up on this, are the ones that have like used them the most. And so
That's
it's cool
cool.
to see, like, okay, yeah, I've been missing this. Like, I sacrificed this piece of having somebody that knew me knew who I was and wanted what was best, for me, and was walking alongside me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't need it. But the more that it was available and the more I learned it wasn't as scary or kind of like trying to make me do something that, I don't know, intrusive, I guess, and
Mm-hmm.
more just allowing that to be more organic, they really globbed on. So, but you have to, I'm like, we don't push it on people, is what I'd say.
Yeah. Have you seen, as your members have taken part in this and started to um, be comfortable with it, they've maybe changed their perspective on the value of what you guys are doing, that they're then taking those learnings and applying them in the disciple making side, the church planting side, the relationship development side in the field, where now storytelling becomes a big part of that disciple making process?
I mean, yeah, I would say absolutely. And I would say, it kind of depends too on what their 100% their ministry is and how that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I think I see that DNA run throughout. Like
Mm,
it's contagious and it's contextualized, appropriately. But yeah, I mean, I think like that's a lot of what we did, and that's why I'm saying the organization as a whole was just very relationship based to begin with.
mm,
And so it's kind of been part of our DNA, but not, maybe people didn't feel like they had the permission
mm-hmm.
to kind of live that out. And so I feel like some of what we do is just come alongside and say like, no, this is okay. And it wasn't
Yeah.
because anybody in the org said it wasn't. It's like in their own heads of what a missionary is supposed to be.
Mm, that's cool. Now, taking a step back, one of the other things that you mentioned that piqued my interest was this idea of our stories and exploring our stories and what is our role in God's story. How we've defined it, how I've talked about it a lot, is as you have God's grand meta narrative, and all of us have a story, and our stories are playing out. And what does it look like for our story to be a piece and a part of that greater grand narrative? And maybe specifically in the disciple making space, like this invitation by the creator of the universe to invite us into partnership with his great grand redemptive narrative. That's a profound truth. Do you find that that's a within your members that that's even a new idea, or do they maybe understand it intellectually and theologically, but how that actually plays out in relationship, what does that really look like? What has that process
So it's
been
so
for you
funny because
guys?
I would flip what you just said for our people. I would say they are living that out. Like that's what
Mm,
they're doing. But I don't know that they would ever give those words to it, or they would say that, or even think that way.
mm,
So like when we come alongside, we're like, oh, that's what you're doing. And so I think part of some of those correctives from like lessons we've learned was like, if we tell people that they are here to like build a church in 7 years or something and make all these connections and go, people feel like they're failing, because what they really
mm,
were doing was walking alongside people, sharing their stories, getting to know them, being a part of one another's, and slowly building something that is going to take way longer than 7 years. But
mm,
it's very valuable. It's very intentional, and so I think it's not setting the goal to something that actually we're not really wanting. Like we want this development,
mm-hmm,
and I'd say like that's what our people are actually doing. Like that's the work.
mm.
um, but they wouldn't be able to vocalize it maybe in that way. But if you watch it, you're like, that's what this is.
So then as you guys help them maybe give words to what they're already doing, do you see that it comes alive more and there's more excitement about, hey, you know what, I am maybe walking in more in obedience than what I thought? You tend to, I know for myself, I tend to be down on myself and beat myself up. What am I doing? Is it actually having any impact? Like all those questions that we all struggle with in ministry. But then you give words like, no, this is, you are absolutely walking in obedience to what, and then the freedom that comes from that when I now have words to what um, maybe already taking place.
Yeah, I mean,
Interesting.
absolutely. I mean, I think you just said it. I think that's exactly, that feeling, that sense of validation. Like, oh no, I am
Mm-hmm.
doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and so now I feel more confident in that, and now I'm going to
Yeah.
go do that more. You know.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Well, Candace, this has been a really fun conversation. I know that you've got a hard stop, so I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time. But as we wrap up, if people want to learn more about what you guys are doing at Avant Ministries, how can they get a hold of you? How can they learn more? Where do you want to point them?
Yeah. I mean, I would say they could send me an email, but my email address is really long, and to spell that's going to be hard. So if they go to our, avantministries.org, there's a connect, connect with us kind of tab. If they write in there, they listen to this podcast, wanted to hear more, it'll go straight to me and I'll be able to kind of reach out.
Awesome. As we wrap up, can I pray for you?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Father, I just thank you so much for this time with Candace and the blessing that this conversation was. And to me, I pray that it would be a blessing to those who hear it. Thank you for what Candace and her team are doing. Seems like, unfortunately, a bit of an innovative approach in the missions world. But I pray that these things would take root and that more people, more ministries, more organizations would start to apply these things that I think are so crucial to our health and our relationship with you and how we interact and relate to you, that these insights and expertise that Candace shared would, at the very least, bring awareness. Father, pray that you would be with her team, lead, direct, guide, Father, as they innovate and try new things and test things, that you would just be a part of that conversation and give clarity and direction to where you want them to go and how you want this member care team to develop. And just thank you for all you're doing. I thank you that we get to be a part of what you're doing and all the creative and fun ways in which you've invited us into partnership with your redemptive work. Lord, we love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Candace, thanks so much for being on the show.
No problem.
I'll talk to you later.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ministry Growth Show. If you've enjoyed it, we'd appreciate it if you rate and review us on your favorite podcasting app, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you have a story or expertise to share with other ministry directors and pastors, or know someone who would be a great guest for the show, let us know. We love connecting with ministry executives and sharing their wisdom and insight with our audience. Just send us an email at podcast@reliantcreative.org. And lastly, if you need help telling your ministry's story, we would love to share how we can help in that process. Check out Reliant Creative at reliantcreative.org and book a call today. See you next time.